So my name is Katie, and today I'm going to talk to you guys about Ivan Pavlov and classical conditioning. So just to start, I want to show of hands how many people have actually heard of classical conditioning before. That's what I expected. That's a good thing. So that way you guys will understand this little joke on the front page. It says, I have successfully conditioned him to smile and write in his book every time I drool. So was Pavlov conditioning his dogs, or were the dogs conditioning him? But that's not what we're going to talk about today. To start, I'm going to kind of explain what classical conditioning is. I know most of you do know, so it might be a review. But I found out that I'm actually terrible at explaining it, so I got this fun video for you guys to watch instead. It's only about a minute.
Pavlov had discovered a fundamental type of learning called classical conditioning. An original stimulus, the dog food, elicits an automatic, unlearned response of salivating. Both stimulus and response happen naturally. They are unconditioned. Then a second neutral stimulus, the bell, that never elicited an unconditioned response of salivating, is introduced just before the presentation of the dog food. If the bell is presented alone and a response occurs as if the bell was dog food, then conditioning has taken place. The bell now makes the dog salivate.
Alright, it's pretty exciting stuff. So let's just kind of a recap of what classical conditioning is. That way you guys are completely aware of it. So how did Pavlov discover this? He was actually started by studying salivation in the upper tract of animals without the intentions of studying this. And then it kind of led him to notice that the dogs would start drooling when they saw the people who were coming to feed the dogs in the white lab coats. So even without food present, like they would start drooling because they saw the people wearing these white lab coats. At first this was called conditioned reflex, but later got turned into classical conditioning. What kind of happened before this event? Pavlov was actually studying to become a priest. This was kind of a big deal in his family back in Russia at this time. But then Alexander II claimed his succession to the throne after the passing of his father, and he allowed Western scientific works to be published in the Russian language. Pavlov then was very interested in this stuff, and he read up on it all the time, and he became very interested and ended up getting his medical degree. And from there he kind of started to focus on digestive processes, and then he actually won a Nobel Prize for his research in digestive processes, but he was so excited about his new thing that he just learned with the white lab coats and the conditioning method, or reflex conditioning in animals, that he, at his ceremony to accept his award, started talking more about classical conditioning than actually what he was winning his Nobel Prize for. So in psychology at this time, psychologists were typically focused on genetic influences and the workings of the human mind and like the development of the mind. So a big name at this time was also Freud and his psychoanalysis. So he's kind of more the talk of the town at this time. He was focused on like the unconscious mind and talk therapy. But then Watson kind of came in with this idea of behaviorism, and that was more focused on studying behaviors of people rather than more like the mind and stuff. And that's kind of where Pavlov comes into play as well. So how is classical conditioning used? So kind of close to immediately after this, Watson did his own study with baby Albert, and I know most of us have learned about Albert. He's the little baby where they presented him with a white rat, and he was not fearful of the rat, but then they added a loud bang with the presence of the rat, and it would scare Albert. So eventually they did that enough times to where the rat would scare Albert himself. So how does it apply today? So you're probably like, what is meatloaf? So let's pretend you guys have eaten meatloaf and it made you sick. And just the smell of meatloaf, the sight of meatloaf, or even tasting it again of meatloaf, it makes you feel sick again. That's kind of classical conditioning. So unfortunately, the meatloaf and you are classically conditioned. It can also be used to explain phobias. So let's say you're scared of a spider and you are just completely terrified of the spider. That would be classical conditioning. So you're fearful of the spider. Luckily, there's a way we can undo this. It's called desensitization. Most of you have probably heard of it in some of your classes. What desensitization is where you kind of learn relaxation techniques, and when presented with a stimulus, you kind of use those techniques to calm down. So you might start by looking at just a picture of a spider, for example, and using your relaxation techniques to calm yourself down from those fears. Next, you might bring like a spider across the room, and it's in an enclosed cage, I would hope, and you work on using those methods that you just learned to desensitize from your fears, and then bring the spider closer until you feel little to no fear at all. And it kind of even applies to my life. So I was talking to my brother last night and telling him about my presentation. He's like, this applies to your life. And I'm like, what do you mean? So when I was younger, he would come down the stairs, or he would call me down the stairs at home, and I'd walk downstairs, and then he'd jump around the corner and terrify me, so I'd be scared. Or like he would hear me coming down the stairs, and he would hide and jump out when I walked past a room. So now, even to this day, I'm terrified to go downstairs. So that's how it applies to my life. And he pointed that out to me last night, and I was like, thank you for that. In conclusion, Pavlov's experiment contributed to the behaviorist movement, and the Watson's behaviorist movement, I should say. It is still very relevant today and to my life, and it explains things such as phobias, as I kind of explained before. And psychology can be interconnected with other sciences. I didn't really mention this, but Pavlov was not actually a psychologist. And I know there's like the big Freud debate, but really Pavlov wasn't even a psychologist either. So it's interesting to see how those disciplines can interconnect with each other, and that's honestly a good thing. Just a quick recap. We talked about what classical conditioning is, how he discovered it, what happened before classical conditioning, and how it is used afterwards and even today. Are there any questions? Jesse?
Did Pavlov, was he inspired by any psychologist then, or was it mostly physical science? I guess, was he inspired by any psychologist in general? So I was wondering.
I think just like Watson's behaviorism, I'm not 100% sure. It just said that he was reading like the Western science movement, so just the works that they were allowed to be published. I'm not quite sure what they were exactly. One of you, whichever.
Okay, you said that these dogs were from previous experiment?
Yes.
So how did they recruit these dogs? Which sounds really weird, but how did they gather these dogs?
I actually don't quite know the answer to that. I'm assuming they just found random dogs. I don't think there's any method to the recruiting, if that's kind of what you were asking. Just random dogs. Yes.
Okay, so you said that being religion was very big in his family. So did you read anything about how his family felt from him changing, wanting to be a priest to studying the Western sciences?
I didn't read anything on that specifically, but it never mentioned that they were upset or anything about it. So I don't think it was as big of a deal that he switched. I'm sure they weren't too pleased at first. But I mean, hey, you want a Nobel Prize from it? You can complain at that, right? Any other questions? All right, thank you.